Hi, I'm Carl Demrow. I'm the Tricks of the Trade writer for Northern Woodlands Magazine, and we're going to do a little video segment today on chainsaw sharpening to accompany the spring 2013 column. So we've got a saw here, and the first thing I want to say about sharpening, before we talk a little bit about teeth parts, is it's really best to have a vise for doing your sharpening. And this is just a little bench vise that I use when I've got some solid wood to clamp onto. If you're in the woods though, and that's what we're really going to be focusing on here, you need one of these vices. This is a stump vise, and it's got two dogs here, and you drive it into a stump or a piece of wood with your felling axe, the axe that you use to pound your wedges. And then you can knock it right out. But it's got a little thumb screw here, and you can tighten it down so that your bar doesn't move, and that's really critical for sharpening. Okay, let's talk a little bit about chain parts. We got a brand new chain here, and here are the important parts of the chain. This is the cutting tooth here, and this is the depth gauge. The cutting tooth has three important parts. The top plate, which slices and is sharpened, it acts as a knife. The side plate over here, which is also sharpened and acts as a knife. And then this working corner here, that little hook. And that's critical because this hook catches the long strands of wood fiber and then directs them either down the side plate or across the top plate to slice them. Now, what does a depth gauge do? The depth gauge sets the amount of wood that the cutting tooth can remove. If your depth gauge is set too low, you're going to have extreme reactive forces in your saw. It's going to make it difficult to control, and it's going to fatigue you a lot more quickly. If it's set too high, your saw won't cut because your cutting teeth can't get a hold of anything. One thing you should also notice here is you can see that the top or the front of the cutting tooth is slightly higher than the back. So as you begin to file this cutting tooth away over time, you also need to be setting your depth gauge. If you never set your depth gauge, you'll be fine for a little while, but once that tooth gets back far enough so that it's just a little bit higher or the same height as the depth gauge here, the saw won't cut anymore, or that tooth won't cut anymore. It's really important to know. This is a Husqvarna chain. It's a model 22 chain. You can see that on the drive tooth there. And it's Husqvarna puts the angle for the top plate, we'll talk about this later, on the side of the depth gauge. See, it says 25 there. Okay, let's talk a little bit about chain pitch. Pitch is the distance between any three rivets divided by 2. Now, why is pitch important? Well, pitch is important when we sharpen, particularly if we're using a roller gauge. And we'll get into the different types of sharpening tools now. Okay, so there are two sharpening gauges that are primarily used in the woods. There's the clip-on file gauge here. This is a steel one. It's made for a 5/32 file. What you need to know about these are very easy to use. They don't have a lot of moving parts. They just clip right onto your file. You need to have the right size gauge for the file that you need for your chain. So if you're in the woods and you've got a couple of different saws that you're using in the woods, you may need to have different gauges here. On the top of the filing gauge, it gives you your top plate angle, and that's the angle that you're going to file this top plate at, and you can see that angle in there, right there. All right. On this saw chain, it's 25 degrees. On the steels, it's different. And as you can see, on this file gauge, it's got 10 and it's got 30. Alright? So that's the flat saw file gauge. The other type of common gauge is the roller gauge, and here's a roller gauge for a 3/8 pitch chain, and here's a roller gauge for a 32nd or 32.5 hundredths of an inch chain pitch. Okay, these are a little bit confusing because here we've got you're oftentimes having to go back and forth between metric, and you're oftentimes having to go back and forth even between fractions and decimal measurements of inch. So a lot of times you'll have to. It's handy to even have a metric conversion scale with you. This gauge also has the depth gauge tool with it as well, and that can be handy. It gives you one less thing to get lost and one less thing to carry around, but I find it's a little bit of a pain when you're using it, getting this thing out of the way and whatnot, but I do like the fact that I can't lose the depth gauge unless I lose this whole thing. Here's another type of depth gauge for your depth gauge tool. Depth gauge filing tool is what this is. This thing here, and these fit over the depth gauge, and we'll show you how that works in a few minutes. There's a setting for hardwood and softwood. Obviously, the softwood setting is going to make the depth gauge a little bit lower. The tooth is going to be able to get, the cutting tooth is going to be able to get a little bit of a larger chip. Okay, files. You need two different types of files: round file for the cutting teeth, and a flat file for your depth gauges. Alright? So without further ado, let's go right to sharpening here.